Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?
Hello again, bookworms. Welcome to Bert's Books, where today we are going to be looking at Absolution, the novelisation of the 1978 feature film, which was directed by Anthony Page and which features an impressive late career performance by Richard Burton, and you certainly can't say that of everything he turned in at this stage of his career. This wouldn't have been the first time Burton had played a priest. He'd played Thomas Becket in Peter Glanville's 1964 epic, and much less prestigiously, he'd donned the vestments for John Boorman's sequel to The Exorcist in 1977. Anyway, Absolution's screenplay was by Anthony Shaffer, he of Sleuth and Wicker Man fame, and in keeping with those two titles, Shaffer also turned in the novelisation of the film, this one being published by Corgi Books in 1979. The film itself received a mixed kind of reception at the time of its release, and although it garnered some level of critical approval, its reputation as an effective and tightly wound thriller has largely happened retrospectively. Set in the cloistered confines of a Catholic boarding school, Absolution makes full use of the potential for intrigue, jealousy, malevolence and power games that this hermetic situation engenders. The central characters consist of two of the teenaged inmates of this institution, the wily teacher's favourite Benji Stanfield, played by Dominic Guard, and his hapless hanger-on, the leg-raised classroom victim and the all-round duffer Arthur Dyson, played by Dai Bradley, who you'll recognise from Kes. Also at the centre of the plot is their chief warden, the dogmatic and deeply repressed Father Goddard, played by Burton, and a rank outsider, the nomadic biker type Blakey, memorably played by young Billy Connolly in his first screen role. Shaffer's novel opens with the metaphysical question, which is also a partial spoiler, as to where you would start should you wish to put a man into hell, the answer being in his belief in the existence of such a thing. This is a neat introduction to the character of Father Goddard from the perspective of the story's near conclusion that he's already been denied entry into hell's alternative due to the deeds of his brightest pupil. From here we're quickly yanked back to the origins of Father Goddard's downfall, the precincts of St Anthony's College, Summersbury, during the closing days of the summer term, at which point exams are concluded and 8 days of non-curricular activities and general larks take place before the school closes. One such lark the previous year, the rigging of the bells so that they would ring continuously, triggered the wrath of the newly appointed Deputy Principal Goddard, God to his pupils, to such an extent that the resultant inquisition thoroughly crushed the rebellious spirits responsible in the eyes of their contemporaries, and the prank went down in history as the last of the great ones, establishing Goddard's reputation as a hound of God. That said though, he's generally a popular teacher among the boys, many of whom crave his approval. A year on from this event and Goddard is marking essays, Arthur Dyson's effort gets a grudging pass, while star pupil Benji Stanfield's job comes close to a glowing 9 out of 10. Marking duties done, Goddard heads off to check in on the dress rehearsals for the end-of-term play, Gilbert and Sullivan's Patience, which Goddard loathes, in which Arthur is dolled up in drag, over-egging his part in a futile attempt to impress or amuse Goddard, who heads backstage for a quick morale-building chat with the other boys. This doesn't extend to conveying any encouragement to Dyson, who's clearly considered a wanker by the rest of the cast. Returning to his study, Goddard's attention is caught by the noise of an approaching motorbike and the unwelcome apparition of the long-haired Blakey, which puts Goddard into a fiercely territorial mode. Blakey is given short shrift when he inquires in a rather over-familiar fashion about the likelihood of any casual work around the school. Goddard, in full view of a gaggle of expectant pupils, sees the impudent Blakey on his way. Dispersing the crowd, Goddard then notices Benji's face in an open window 2 floors above, and it appears Stanfield has been somewhat transfixed by Blakey's appearance. That evening, Benji is summoned to God's study, supposedly so God can congratulate him on his excellent essay and to spend an hour discussing Gerard Manley Hopkins, or more specifically the fleeting nature of beauty, before the evening meal. It's here that we get some insight into Goddard's favouritism, or, as he thinks of it, special caring. Benji is no specimen of physical beauty, but he's sharp-witted, energetic and intense. He's had a troubled family background, meaning priests have effectively become substitute parents to him, and he's a prodigy on the playing field. Goddard is aware that Benji is a competitive, potentially malicious personality who requires careful handling, but he's generally popular and gracious in his successes and has attained the position of deputy head boy. Inwardly, Goddard is aware that his kind of special caring in this woman-free environment is a treacherous labyrinth, an area in which he sometimes had to give some guidance to younger priests and pupils, but nonetheless one that he himself feels he has passed through unscathed by any transgressions. Goddard's soul is bridal white. Blakey, meanwhile, hasn't been chased off too far. He is robustly self-sufficient. He set up a camp in the woods that adjoin the school grounds, nursing resentful feelings towards that bastard Crow and his little blue-eyed buggers, and an ambition to get even with them. While the debut performance of Gilbert and Sullivan's Patience gets underway in the school hall, Blakey is in through the back window, stuffing a sizable glazed ham into his backpack, along with a bottle of Black Label, before heading off into the night. He's intercepted, though, by Benji, who's snuck out for a crafty ciggy. The confrontation becomes physical. Blakey stifled Benji's cry for assistance by clamping his own mouth over Benji's, shocking him into silence. They warily agree to call it a draw. You're pretty strong, lad, for a puffy schoolgirl. And bidding Benji, don't sell my hide to the crows. Vanishing into the night before Benji belatedly raises the alarm over the robbery. For Stanfield, the confrontation represents a threshold of experience. Goddard heads up to the dorm to check on Benji's bruises, a process that verges on physical contact, which the father is noticeably jumpy. But they're interrupted by a gaggle of boys, which include Arthur Dyson, whose needy hero worship of Benji is apparent. Seeing them off, Goddard then presents Benji, who's steering the priest away from the conclusion that the guilty party was Blakey, with a talisman for his safekeeping. The pre-bedtime dormitory banter that follows threatens to become confrontational, Arthur being roundly verbally abused, Stanfield being accused of arse-licking towards Goddard, but somehow the situation is dissipated, with Arthur's one pronounced talent, that of mimicry. He does a note-perfect Goddard, which diffuses the tension, but calls down the wrath of the prefect Sackville, as Arthur has ventured into dangerous waters by joking about Goddard and Stanfield's relationship. The following morning, Goddard is breakfasting with the boys who served mass that morning in a private room away from the main dining hall, as a privilege for the altar boys who include Dyson and Stanfield. Goddard utilises these occasions to expound upon a particular point of Catholicism with the boys, and today's subject is the nature of confession and its absolute inalienable secrecy. Arthur proves over-persistent in querying the mechanics of this, and when he brings the subject of masochism into the conversation, he's rewarded with a stinging and very public rebuke from Goddard, a process that is then repeated in the following Latin lesson. At the end of this lesson, Father Rivers casually informs Goddard that he's taken on a gypsy for a few odd jobs around the place, immediately realising that Rivers is referring to Blakey Goddard Bristles. About 10 minutes later, Arthur and Benji are engaged in some translation when their attention is diverted by the appearance in the window of a shirtless, chamois-wielding Blakey. Unnoticed by Goddard, Benji and Blakey recognise and greet each other through mimed display, immediately arousing Arthur's curiosity as Blakey's clowning takes on an increasingly homoerotic quality. Benji then implores Arthur not to reveal to anybody that he's bonded with this outsider, cajoling him with crumbs of the friendship that Dyson so desperately craves from him. Goddard, meanwhile, is convinced that a bad influence has worked its way into their establishment and heads off to remonstrate with the head over his taking Blakey on. But he's then informed that he's in line for principalship once Rivers retires. With that in mind, could he loosen the fuck up with the orthodoxy, please? Benji, meanwhile, has sussed out that Blakey must be camping out in the woods, and he's strangely excited by this knowledge. That evening, on the pretext of taking the cross-country route, he's out into the woods to locate Blakey's camp. Their reunion is initially confrontational, Benji having announced himself with a missile from a slingshot, which is actually Arthur's property, as a payback for the previous night. But warily, they establish a sort of temporary and fragile peace that's rather undone by a display of posh school priggishness on Benji's part. Blakey packs him off with the advice not to be taken in by that black-hearted bastard, i.e. Goddard. He's empty and hungry. It's you, Benji, he'll feed on. Benji is a bit shocked by Blakey's heretical manner, but is nonetheless slightly smitten by him. Arriving back breathless from his run, he's pulled up by Goddard, who's just been discussing his abiding dislike of Dyson with Rivers, who's tried to argue with Goddard that Arthur evidently admires him and that he should build on this. Having packed Benji off to the dinner hall, they discuss Goddard's hopes for the boy and his future potential as a Jesuit priest. Arthur, meanwhile, has got the idea from Benji's secretive goings-on that Benji has got a girl on the go and badgers him to reveal. Benji bullshits him that he's carrying on with Blakey's sister. Arthur solemnly pledges not to reveal any of this to Goddard. However, Arthur later overhears talk that Goddard is aware of Blakey's presence on the grounds and plans to turn him over to the police. Desperate for Benji's friendship, Arthur rushes to warn him of this. Benji plays Arthur along with dangled tokens of friendship, letting Arthur in on the fact that Blakey was the other night's thief, and that he would then head out to warn Blakey off. Arthur must cooperate with him in convincing the other lads that they should keep their mouths shut. Back at the camp, Blakey is teaching Benji to tickle trout, and they settle down for a congenial fish supper, over which their previous antagonism evaporates, helped by a few glugs from the stolen whiskey bottle. Sneaking back into the dorm, Benji is nearly rumbled by Goddard, who gives Dyson, who's still awake, a verbal roasting before examining the shoes of the not really asleep Benji, noticing that the soles are dirty and wet. The following morning lessons are cancelled due to a staff meeting, which means that Benji can slip out into the woods again, though by now some of the other lads have caught wind of things and have tried to talk him out of his budding friendship. On his way out, though, he's summoned to the heads and is surprised to find Goddard sitting alone in the office. Goddard announces that his appointment has been confirmed in that morning's meeting. Benji has been called to the office for other reasons, though. His term's result means that he is now the Dux DUX of the school. Goddard, clearly pleased that his star pupil should have attained this, brings up the subject of a calling to the priesthood, a subject which brings up a slight ideological difference of views. Goddard then tackles the subject of Benji's new friend. Someone has been telling tales, and here it becomes more disharmonious between them. Freedom is the banner that unscrupulous ways will march under. Goddard is adamant that Blakey is a bad lot and insists that Benji must have nothing further to do with him. Rather than do the obvious and head straight for the woods, Benji seeks out the clique of pupils known as the God Squad and acts like a total swankpot over his position of confidence with the deputy head before challenging Corley to a tennis match that afternoon. An engagement in which Benji easily thrashes his rival before treating a gushing Arthur with appalling offhandedness. In the meantime, summoned by Goddard, two local bobbies head over to Blakey's camp and, in a display of the kind of police work that was making a name for itself around 1978, rough up Blakey quite severely. Benji arrives to find Blakey in a shocking state and openly weeps at the state that the coppers have left his new and now semi-comatose friend. Dashing back to school in time for evening sermon, Benji is subjected to a pointed treatise from Goddard on separating the weeds from the good wheat, which is very definitely aimed at him. He then, rather shamelessly considering his behaviour earlier that day, enlists Arthur's help in covering for him as he heads out to the woods again, where this time Blakey is fully conscious but appears to be holding Benji responsible for the events earlier that day and tells him to fuck off. Clearly stung by Blakey's rejection, we see Benji make a fateful grab for a heavy stone, which is then hurled into the darkness. We cut from here to a confessional booth where Benji has pleaded with Goddard to let him unburden a terrible weight on his conscience, namely that he's had sexual relations with Blakey, a notion that obviously cuts Goddard to the core. Having dispensed the penances here, the following morning Goddard's revenge is more widely felt. A generous administration of canings for all complicit in Benji's absence the previous evening, which includes Arthur, and Benji has landed corridor scrubbing duties while the rest are on the end-of-term picnic. This supposedly light-hearted event culminates in further humiliation for Arthur, whose lack of nerve and ability prevent him from redeeming himself in Goddard's eyes on some sort of cadet-related rope contraption, which Arthur is clearly not cut out for. Later that evening, Benji approaches Goddard in the chapel again, and although he's clearly defied Goddard's orders and headed out into the woods another time, he implores the father to hear him out in confessional once more. This time, however, he admits to something far worse. He informs Goddard that, in a fit of jealousy, he's caved Blakey's head in with a rock. Here begins the giddying downward spiral of jealousy, manipulation and deceit, a vicious unravelling of lives that all hinges on the central principle of the sanctity of the confessional. I'm not going to lay it all out here and give it away, as I'd implore you to either watch the film, read the book or both. We've been given a number of clues up to now as to what strings might have been pulled and by whom for the novel to wind up where it does. And it does take this a step further than the film, namely that the novel ends with an aged man who's now passed some years of his life in prison in a Trappist monastery in France. His life is slipping away, and as he breathes his last, a postcard falls from his grasp. It's a note to inform him that a young Marist brother, formerly Arthur Dyson of Summerfield College, has died in the service of the Lord in South America. It's an undeniably sad ending, though slightly more redemptive than that film plot allows us. Shaffer, who was also the scriptwriter for the film, kept his novel very much in keeping with the spirit of the screenplay, but without sacrificing anything of the taut pacing and claustrophobic tension. His novel manages to enhance and even elevate his story in a number of ways throughout. In common with the Wicker Man, Shaffer's Goddard, much like Sergeant Howie before him, while being even-handedly portrayed and even with some sympathy, is a difficult man to like, and one who is entangled by canny manipulation of his deeply held and perhaps inflexible religious dogma. Absolution is a masterful set piece of conflicted faith and loyalties, the use and misuse of power, and the terrifying extremes that the adolescent or even merely human need for love and acceptance can lead to. It's an exemplary film novelisation and a work that is deserving of wider appreciation.
Done to my banjo.